Welcome to Brock U Research. Consider this, where thoughts and conversations come together. My name is Mike Saunders, and I'll be your host and moderator for our discussion today on well-being. Well, the tree has been taken down, the credit card bills are already starting to roll in, and not only that, it's cold and dark outside. You go on Facebook and are confronted by holiday pictures of your friends' timelines, and you're wondering if somehow you've missed the boat. 'Tis the season when many people experience a slump in their moods and thoughts turn to the concept of well-being. What exactly is well-being anyway? What are the beliefs and practices we can employ to create and, more importantly, sustain a sense of well-being? Or are those questions irrelevant? Here to help us understand more about the subject from different perspectives are Brock professors Michael Busseri, Colleen Hood, and Kathy Belicki. Associate Professor Michael Busseri from the Department of Psychology studies the meaning of well-being, life satisfaction, and evaluations of past, present, and future well-being, among other subjects. Professor Colleen Hood from the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies researches the role of leisure in achieving well-being among people dealing with mental health issues. And Professor Kathy Belicki, also in the Department of Psychology, focuses on the relationship between forgiveness and forgiveness-seeking and well-being. And welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, Professor Busseri, how is well-being defined in your research?
Well, there's basically two broad traditions of thinking about well-being, and each has a very long philosophical history. But in a lot of psychological research, well-being is thought of in one of two ways. One approach focuses on how people feel about their life. How do they evaluate their life in terms of it being good or bad, and their experiences of positive moods, being happy, excited, and so forth, and the absence of negative moods or affect, guilt and sadness and worry. So that approach is what we typically align with the idea of happiness. Are you happy with your life? Are you feeling happy about something? A second tradition focuses on aspects related to living a life of meaning and purpose and personal growth. And so these two traditions account for a lot of the research on well-being these days.
Professor Hood, what form does well-being take in the form of leisure?
We look specifically at what the context and experience of leisure can bring to a person's life. And so we believe that leisure is a context in which we can engage in freely chosen activities that most closely represent our true selves, that we anticipate pleasure, satisfaction, growth, development from. And so leisure, well used in my field of study, has the potential to contribute significantly to well-being. The issue is, of course, that many of us don't use leisure particularly well. And some people have unique challenges associated with using leisure well.
Professor Belicki, what is the relationship between well-being and forgiveness?
Well, in terms of well-being, in my research, I've focused on emotional and physical health. And actually, it's kind of a tricky question because forgiveness means different things to different people. So depending on the form of forgiveness, some forms of forgiveness do seem to result in better emotional health, even better physical health. But some other forms of forgiveness definitely don't. They can leave you feeling quite a bit worse off. Some forms of forgiveness help restore a relationship, and that could be a good thing if it's a good relationship, but if it's a toxic relationship, that could be a very damaging thing. Now, if we flip it around and look at unforgiveness, unforgiveness is definitely not good by anyone's standards. Feeling really angry can be empowering, but it's not a pleasant emotion. It's very hard on the body, and it also takes a toll on relationships because no one wants to be around someone who's angry all the time. So unforgiveness is definitely a problem, but the question is, how do we get out of that? Forgiveness can be one way to move out of that unforgiving space, but it's not the only way.
How do we, or can we, achieve a sense of well-being?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, I guess. If anyone had the answer, they would be very wealthy persons. Although, bookshelves in stores are full of advice columns and products people can buy purportedly to increase their well-being. But judging by the posters, I think Coke brings happiness, doesn't it? And McDonald's and...
Don't forget being skinny.
I'm trying to think of where I've seen all the words happiness on so many different ads recently. I guess it's becoming quite a marketing pitch. So I guess people tend to think that buying stuff brings them happiness.
I'm sure you would agree with me that the research shows that's definitely not the case. I would suggest, particularly from my field of study, leisure studies, that it's more the way you choose to engage in your own life. And I think from my own experience working with people with mental health issues, they think they have no control over that. And so it's also believing that your own efforts towards making your life better can actually be effective. I actually do believe you can do things to enhance your well-being, and I certainly do not believe it has anything to do with how many pairs of shoes you have, although that personally would make me very happy.
Well, the problem with anything like a pair of shoes or things we buy is that once we have something, we get used to it. It's the same principle when you live beside busy traffic, that after a while you stop hearing it. So you get that new fancy TV, and I remember the first time I got a new fancy TV, I really enjoyed it for a week, and then it just fades. So those kinds of things, we just settle back to a kind of common level, don't we?
And that's such an interesting phenomenon because psychologically it works the same way, whether it's the experience of good things or bad things, that this amazing ability we seem to have as humans that we don't seem fully aware of. We've all had enough experience buying things that we should know. However excited we are for the new car, the new pair of shoes, the new house, eventually we're going to get used to that thing. We're going to adapt, and it's no longer going to be the thrill. And similarly, on the negative side, whether it's colleagues that annoy us or troubles at home or something financial, in many, many cases, we adjust, we adapt, and we move on, but we don't seem well aware of that ability. And some people have referred to this as a psychological immune system, just like the body's physiological immune system seems to work unbeknownst to us. The argument, I guess, is psychologically a similar thing happens, and we don't seem well enough aware of this. So we tend to make decisions as if this wasn't going to happen, as if we weren't going to adapt to the new whatever. But we do.
That lack of awareness is a bit of a double-edged sword. So when I'm having a particularly rough time of it, I forget that over time, eventually I will probably come out of this and come back to my sort of stable level wherever I'm at. And also we forget that our efforts to try to make our life better, we have to be very purposeful and mix them up. I will have people who'll say, I know the one thing that makes me happy, and I'm going to do it every day for the rest of my life. And it's like, yeah, that's not going to work so well for you. We have to find a number of things. You have to mix them up, and you have to be really purposeful. You have to make a habit out of practicing some of these things, but you can't practice them habitually the same way.
And do you find that some things, Colleen, are better choices over other things in terms of well-being?
In my world, it's so very individualized. I tend to believe, because I'm a leisure researcher, that active engagement is better than passive. And that doesn't mean it has to be physically active, but it has to engage your mind, your emotions, your body in some way. People who have more active engagements tend to have higher levels of happiness and well-being. But I think it all depends on balance. So if I have a career that's very demanding and requires me to be very engaged, perhaps active engagement and leisure isn't as essential to me. It's very personal. For me, I think what's most important is that I make a conscious decision to try to seek out things that generate positivity and a sense of well-being, and I'm purposeful about that because I think we have a little more control. People are so passive and they think they can't do anything to make their own lives better, and I don't believe that.
There's some research that suggests that one way to perhaps buy happiness or well-being is to be spending your money on things that are going to bring experiences as opposed to material goods. And the thinking there is that through buying experiences, and here it could be, pair tickets to a concert, a meal out with some friends, but in buying experiences, often those experiences bring us into connection with other people. Whereas spending money on material goods, we often, as we were saying before, adjust very quickly to those new goods. One thought is that money can be spent in ways that benefit our well-being if they're the kinds of expenses that provide experiences for us, perhaps because that brings us closer to others.
A psychiatrist named Larry Davidson did a study on supported socialization for people with mental health issues. He did a number of different things, but one of them was he gave the people with mental health issues $10, and that they could spend that $10 to do something with this person that they'd been paired with for socialization. And the people who spent that money on their friends had a greater bump in well-being than the ones who went out and spent it on their bills or bought their groceries or whatever. So I also think not only spending it so that it allows you to be in the company of others is very helpful, but also using it to help others probably has a profound impact on well-being.
I have in recent years come to increasingly appreciate how we are social beings. So I'm by nature an introvert. It took me a long time to really appreciate that we are fundamentally social beings. And the more research we do, we find that so having good social ties is connected with better emotional well-being, better physical health. But that notion, too, of getting out of ourselves. So one of the things when I was talking about forms of forgiveness is that paradoxically, people who forgive in order to feel better, when you ask them why are they forgiving, their explicit reason is that they want to feel better. And for them, forgiveness then usually means some kind of process of sort of letting go, moving on. They may never even talk to the person again that hurt them. Oddly enough, we found in our research, we've had mixed findings, but by and large, as a group, it's not doing much for them. It's working for some, but not for others. But the people who forgive for some reason outside of themselves, it's like they lose themselves by moving out of themselves into being concerned about humanity, for example. Well, forgiveness is good for the world, so by gar, I'm going to struggle with this. Or they really spend some time thinking about the person who injured them and why did they do this? And there must be something, some reason, or they do it out of some kind of position of humility, but the movement is away from themselves out. They're not forgiving to feel better, but they feel better than the people who forgive in order to feel better. It's an interesting paradox there. Another way sometimes to feel better yourself is to do something for another. That said, at times we've got to take care of ourselves. Right. You know, when I'm training people around to be therapists, the first thing I teach them is self-care. You have nothing to offer others if you can't first take care of yourselves. But then we just seem to do better when we get lost in experiences or have that movement out towards others.
One way to think about that question of taking care of ourselves is in terms of whether there's a certain amount of money that people need to meet their basic needs, and then beyond that certain amount, would more income, disposable or otherwise, boost our well-being? And as you might imagine, that's been a very popular question in the research. And for several decades, there was a debate back and forth whether increases in income could lead to increases in well-being. And now the research has sort of coalesced around this idea that up to a certain point, money does bring greater happiness, especially if your basic needs aren't being met. So if you don't have a stable roof over your head or food on the table or clothes and sort of can pay the bills, take care of one's health, then every boost in your income is going to probably bring greater sense of satisfaction, at the very least, with one's life. I think it was last year or the year before, some American researchers have suggested that past a household income of about $65,000 or $75,000, past that level, greater income isn't really associated or predictive of greater well-being. That's a very limited way to think about self-care. You know, do I have money to sort of take care of my basic needs? But I think that that's probably an important consideration, because some people, probably the first thing they think about when it comes to money, for example, is all the things that they could get that they don't have. And for some individuals, those would be things that they don't really need, but they'd want. And in other cases,
they're leisure toys, right? Because we often spend our discretionary income on all the accoutrements of leisure that we think are going to make the experience so much better and make us so much happier, when in fact don't really last very long.
We read each other's research a bit before we came into this conversation, and one of the things that really jumped and stayed with me, Michael, was your thoughts about this quest for happiness in the first place. We started with the language of well-being, but immediately that language of happiness creeps in, and there's this seeming quest out there to have more and more, and that the goal is happy. And is happy really well-being, or can it take other forms? Or
Yeah, that second sort of tradition of research on well-being, the one focused on meaning and purpose in life, in some sense sounds much more esoteric, and maybe it's harder for people to relate to, and it's probably harder to market as well. But for better or worse, we seem to be stuck with this word happiness. Research on happiness, as long as it's been around, has really opted to go for what we would call a subjective approach, which boils down to, rather than telling people what it means to be happy and what it means to have well-being, to ask people. And if people say they're satisfied, they're doing okay, then to take that at face value. So if you were to really push someone and say, well, what does happiness mean? Certainly you wouldn't find a consensus among researchers, and I suspect you'd find a lot of different answers from people who don't spend their days in the ivory tower thinking about weird questions like this.
But it got me wondering about contentment versus happy, or that quest for more, which versus just being content with. And I sort of read in your reflections some things about that, about is it the case that we need to have more and more and more, or is it the case that maybe there's a case for contentment somewhere in this?
This is an idea I first came across, I believe it was in a Globe and Mail article a couple of years ago, and the title was something like The Tyranny of Happiness.
Oh, what a title.
And soon after that, I read a book by Barbara Ehrenreich, and it was basically questioning or addressing the same issue, that is this emphasis on being all we can be and living the best life possible, at least for some people, counterproductive, because it places a lot of pressure on us to maximize everything we can from seemingly every moment, every experience, every encounter. It's not clear yet, at least from the research, whether that's the best way to go, to think about life as something that has to be maximized, squeezed for everything it's got every moment of every day. So your question about contentment, I think, is a really interesting one, because some people are really motivated to try to find these peak experiences with the belief that a well-lived life is a life that is full of high highs, lots of really exciting moments. And others seem most geared towards trying to find a way to relax. And so the choices they make are not so much about finding the peaks, but perhaps getting rid of the stresses and just finding a time out from things. So when I think about that kind of question, I'm reminded of that difference. I suspect our personalities might have a lot to do with the direction that we're trying to go in with our lives. Are we looking for more and more and more? Or are we looking for less, maybe? Less of the negative stuff, less of the pressures, and trying to find enjoyment and satisfaction through appreciating what we already have.
Our balance is going to be different for each person. I thought hard about the question as well, this pressure to live the best life possible. And then I think about some of the people that I work with who, are just in the depths of despair and can't even notice the sun when it rises. For me, it always comes down to balance. Like, can we squeeze a little more goodness out of life for those folks without putting that pressure on that, you've got to constantly be working to maximize your positive emotion or your happiness or your well-being or your personal growth. And maybe because I'm a leisure person, we're all about balance, relaxation and activation. And I think it's also balance in terms of well-being, make some efforts towards increasing well-being, but don't drive yourself nuts over it. Don't make yourself miserable trying to have greater well-being.
There's the thought of the day.
To all of you, I ask this question: are we collectively barking up the wrong tree, as it were, when it comes to well-being? In other words, are we looking for well-being in all the wrong places?
I think that we are a society that has become increasingly busy, increasingly disconnected from one another, increasingly focused on acquisition of material stuff, and we mistakenly believe that if we work harder, work longer, work faster, make more money, we're going to be happier. We talked about contentment earlier. I think people have forgotten the beauty of contentment that sometimes comes just from slowing down. I kind of think we are barking up the wrong tree, and we have an awful lot of unhappy people out there, so something's not working right.
couple of things that strike me about this society in particular is we are so individualistic. By that I mean we're a society that believes that who I am gets defined by my accomplishments in isolation. We encourage and value autonomy and independence. And as a result, we tend to underestimate just how connected we are and need to be. And hence, when I think of some of the most exquisite moments I've had, they didn't involve things. They involved moments with people. And sometimes simple moments. I mean, one I can think of, was sitting with a dear friend, and we were at a highway stop on a piece of cement, just perched on the roadside beside the car having popsicles. And it was just a perfect moment, and that required virtually no money. Both of us, it was a perfect moment for both of us, and we couldn't say why, and I remember it 20 years later. But it was a together moment. And that's just something that, as I say, as a society, we undervalue, and increasingly we have technology which tends to drive us apart or give us a sort of substitute relationships over face-to-face relationships, which was even telling as we sit in this room with these microphones. One of the things that was important to us is that we see each other. And, the microphones are large, and we found ourselves sort of dodging around. There's something important when you're talking to somebody. It's just so much better when I can see you. And that gets lost. The other thing that what you were saying there, Colleen, I find too, and you may find this with the folks that you're working with, I've also studied trauma, and that following trauma sometimes, not always, but sometimes people come to a new understanding about life that they just didn't have before. A greater appreciation for the value of peacefulness instead of the highs, for contentment, for meaning. It is hard to do to achieve that meaning, but increasingly we're finding that people who can articulate a meaning to life feel better. And not uncommonly, it's after those awful things in life that sometimes people for the first time struggle to a sense of meaning and a sense of connectedness. So these things are intangible, and they sure don't cost money. They do take effort, but they're apparently worth the struggle.
One of the things that interests me is how people situate themselves in time, and whereas some individuals are very future-oriented, it's all about the next accomplishment or the next thing that's going to happen in the future. Others seem almost stuck in the past, sometimes in good situations, others in not-so-great situations. And then there are those folks that seem to be in the now. And so when I hear Kathy and Colleen, some of your comments, it reminds me of this. Sitting by the roadside with a friend and having a popsicle, that's a very now moment. And I'm not sure that's the secret to happiness or well-being for everybody, but it does seem to be the case that one of the things that happens, certainly in our society, is the expectation that things will get better and better. One way to think about that is in terms of time, and what that basically says is that the well-being, the happiness, the satisfaction, the meaning will happen in the future, not now. And that's another way I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, is not only sort of in this abstract way that somehow life isn't everything I think it should be, but we're also in some ways, I think, often comparing ourselves to a standard, and that glorious golden future where everything is better, that can be quite a standard to compare oneself against. It turns out that a lot of people in a lot of countries around the world sort of have this general belief that life is supposed to get better and better over time until you hit the age of about 60 or 70, and then people believe that life gets worse and worse. But certainly for much of the lifespan, this sense of more, better is kind of a pervasive theme to the stories we tell ourselves about life and what's supposed to happen.
On the subject of little things that help us to achieve well-being, something as simple as taking a walk in your lunch hour rather than sitting at your desk and going through your emails. Something like that can help you to achieve well-being, and it doesn't cost any money.
There's a suggestion from Daniel Kahneman, who's an award-winning, Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, and he describes in his TED Talk his idea of two selves. And there's the one self that lives moment to moment. He refers to as the experiencing self. This is the you or I that's sort of experiencing things in the here and now. Then he talks about this other self, a storytelling self, and this is the self that has beliefs about me, who I was in the past, who I'll be in the future. And certainly decisions like, what am I going to do with my lunch, may be particularly relevant to the experiencing self. So the one that's in the here and now, doing the living as it unfolds day to day. So it's not about what's going to happen tomorrow, and it's not about what happened yesterday. It's what decision am I going to make now that may, even if it doesn't last for very long, but may bring a little boost. It may be a leisure decision. I don't know if walking at lunch would be considered, I suppose, by some folks leisure. Others it would be physical exertion and not very welcomed, but...
If you chose it freely with the expectation of some kind of positive feeling of it, it would fall within our rubric of leisure. So I would consider that to be leisure.
There is this whole movement right now societally towards various forms of mindfulness meditation, for example. And I think it's a response to that sense of needing to start living more in the present moment rather than projecting into the future or getting lost in these stories we tell about ourselves. It's interesting, too, because one of the things that makes a difference, especially when I look at trauma and people responding from trauma, and we're all going to experience trauma in our lives, you just can't skate through. One of the things I say to my students is, when I have the trauma lecture, because it's a tough lecture for people who've been traumatized, it's like some of you, a good number of you, are about to hear a difficult lecture. The rest of you, give it a chance. The time will come when this will be a difficult lecture for you. One of the things about navigating trauma is about gradually allowing yourself to experience those feelings. When tough times happen, we go numb. We need to go numb. But numbness can become a habit of life where you just live in stories and you're not living in the moment. And to the extent that we can gradually face the difficult emotions, it allows us to then also live more fully in that present and have that greater quality of life. That is just, it's just so precious. I sort of pause because I find myself lacking words for that quality of being able to live fully in the moment. And to be able to live fully in the moment, you can't be cutting off and excluding certain emotions. So we certainly see that when I'm studying forgiveness also, that forgiveness is usually a long, painful process, however defined, but the kinds of forgivenesses that lead to better well-being are usually long, painful processes where you don't just kind of shove aside the hurt. You allow the hurt to live and breathe and don't take shortcuts to letting this person off the hook. And in the long run, you get the better outcomes from that, but it's more painful in the short term.
I agree that we have to create the space for both uncomfortable emotions as well as the more positive ones. And in my work, we connect mindfulness with the concept of savoring. A fellow named Fred Bryant wrote a book on savoring and talks about how we actually have to be somewhat present in the current moment to even notice and appreciate what might be good in that moment. If I'm really future-oriented or I'm really past-oriented and I'm not here right now, I'm going to miss out some opportunities that might in fact give me a slight bump in how I'm feeling at the moment. And so I think that being present-centered piece is really, really, really important.
And you know, kids are great at this. And they're also great at being with their emotions, whether that's happiness or sadness, frustration or joy and excitement, largely because in terms of their cognitive development, they have no other way of doing this. You know, I'm thinking kids 3, 4, 5, 6, wherever they're at emotionally, you know it. Mm-hmm. If you're in the room with them, it's an amazing thing to see. I mean, eventually, as their brains develop, and as their psychology develops, the way they cope and so forth, they will find other ways to deal with their emotions, sometimes unfortunately by trying to ignore them and so forth. But up until a certain age, they're there in the moment with however they're feeling. And it can be quite a ride because there are plenty of ups and downs as they travel through their present moments.
We have somehow come to a place where we are terrified of those uncomfortable emotions. We aren't like those kids anymore who sort of ride whatever the wave of whatever they feel. And so now people, when they don't feel well, whether or not they've experienced trauma or anything else, they so don't want to feel angry, sad, afraid, anxious, that they stop feeling altogether. You know, when we're talking about well-being, no matter how you define it, whether it's the life well lived or positive experiences and contentment, if you don't feel anything, pretty hard to get to well-being. So how do we make space? How do we help people make space for those uncomfortable emotions and know that this too shall pass? One of my favorite sayings, this too shall pass. However I feel right now, this too shall pass. And I don't need to run away from it or shut down from it.
The idea of a sort of stigma associated with mental health, I think, quite often comes back to this issue. The stigma, at least the public face of that stigma, is the fact that there are individuals who are struggling in the now And that's quite different from how we're supposed to look. So this idea of trying to reconcile what it means to experience my life as it's happening with the expectation that this should be good, this should be meaningful, this should be enjoyable, and it should also be getting better. Sounds exhausting, doesn't it?
I'm so tired, just as you said it, yes.
It's depleting my well-being just thinking about it.
By and large, we have more leisure time now than we've ever had before in many cases. Yet for many people, that doesn't translate into more well-being in our lives. So what's the problem?
I'd say we actually don't have more leisure time than we had in the past. There's this myth out there that we are this affluent society and we have all this extra time for leisure. But in fact, people are working longer hours. Many people are working more than one job. Most households are dual income households, and so all the domestic responsibilities fall to the time that historically might have been free for a family to recreate together. So I would say that's a myth. We don't have more leisure time. And I think people are disconnected and tired and stressed. And when you feel that way, your ability to get out there and be actively engaged in something that's going to, help you develop as a human being or help you find your purpose, that takes a lot of effort. And people are tired, and so they come home and they sit on the sofa and they eat chips and drink beer and watch TV. In my field, that's something that we actively try to combat. There's a place for some of that, but people also have to find those experiences that allow them to express parts of themselves that might otherwise not get expressed, or connect with people in a context that's not work-related. We need to find some balance.
And the wonderful thing is you can start small. The other thing that comes out of my side study of trauma is the remarkable resilience of people, how little things can make such a huge difference. So if you're sitting at home now listening to us and going, yes, I'm exhausted, I'm stressed, I'm tired, and I'm on my couch and I don't want to do anything else, we're not saying you've got to overhaul that life completely. Little changes can make an immense difference, and it costs very little to try. So pick one little thing, or spend a few minutes more with somebody, or get out of that office at lunch break for a few minutes and give it a shot, give it a try and see how it works for you, because there'll be no harm in trying. Small things can make a huge difference.
Probably the most important resource, commodity, and thus gift we have is our time. And one of the small ways I think people can make choices that may be beneficial is thinking about how they spend their time in terms of decisions. There are things that we have to do, whether it's family-related or work-related or in any other domain or activity that are responsibility and commitments we have, but there's also a good part of our day that's about choices that we do have some control over. And that may be one of the ways to start looking for some of these small changes, is to think about how we spend our time in terms of choices. It's often the things that matter most to us fall down the list simply because, just like at work, where the fires pop up, where the urgent matters, that email with the red flag on it, we respond to that stuff the quickest, but not everything is a red flag.
We tend to think about the activities we choose to do for ourselves, the leisure activities. We tend to think that those are the things we do after all the important things in life are taken care of. In our field, we argue all the time that that is just as important as the other stuff, and that you have to make a priority on finding those experiences that engage you, that refresh your batteries, that connect you with other people, that allow you to be of service, that allow you to develop and express your strengths that might not otherwise be expressed. So as a society, we say leisure is the time left over after all the important stuff is done, and usually that's none. From my perspective, leisure is one of the most central contexts that people have, that they can actually exercise their choice to engage in experiences that will support greater well-being, however you decide to define that.
So as we wrap up the conversation, let's go around the table for your final thoughts on how to achieve a sense of well-being in our lives today. So Michael, we'll begin with you.
Well, I guess I prefer to not think of it in terms of achievement, but for me in terms of a series of questions. So when we talk about well-being, are we thinking about enjoyment or meaning or purpose? And depending on how we answer that question might change how we approach a given situation or a decision. And as I mentioned before, the issue of time. I'm constantly trying to remind myself when I'm trying to make decisions, is this a choice that has to be made now? Is this a decision that's going to impact my life at present, or this is a future-oriented choice, or perhaps even a past-oriented choice, addressing some mistake or something left over from the past? So I think time and how we position ourselves in our past or in our futures or in the now is an important thing to consider as well.
Colleen?
Well, I had a list, but now I've changed it completely after participating in our discussion. So I would say that first and foremost for me is you have to be present for your life. And if you want to feel better, you have to be willing to feel both the positive and the uncomfortable. It's important to me that people find an opportunity to develop and express their strengths. And for most of us, that happens in leisure if we don't have the luxury of that in the workplace. So I think those are my things. Be present, feel what life has to offer you, and discover and use your strengths.
And finally, Kathy?
And I'm going to focus on the social side, that the one thing we can really do for ourselves is to strengthen and develop relationships, find good relationships, develop relationships. And then one of the realities of those relationships is if you know me long enough, I'm going to hurt you. If I know you long enough, you're going to hurt me. And so we need to find some way to navigate that. And therefore, when we're the person who hurts, being prepared to apologize or do what needs to be done to mend that. And if I'm the person who has been hurt, then again, certain forms of forgiveness can be useful. I sort of hinted at that in the beginning. In a nutshell, they are forgiveness that is a choice. Forgiveness when you do it because you ought to do it. Actually, we tend to see very poor outcomes. You tend to have lingering anger and upset. So forgiveness needs to be something you choose to do and want to do rather than feel you ought to do. And then the reasons you choose are important. So forgiveness that is for noble reasons, if you will, for the betterment of humanity, to help this person who has hurt you, or out of just simple recognition that we're all human and can make errors. That's the kind of reasons for forgiving that we have found is associated with better well-being.
And on that note, we'll wrap up our well-being discussion. We've been talking with Professor Kathy Belicki from the Department of Psychology, Professor Colleen Hood from the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies, and Associate Professor Michael Busseri from the Department of Psychology, all, of course, at Brock University. Thank you all for coming into the studio.
My pleasure.
Our pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you.